No Milênio de hoje, vamos reapresentar trechos de duas entrevistas que revelam detalhes dos bastidores dos atentados de 11 de setembro e das ações militares dos Estados Unidos no Afeganistão e no Iraque. O primeiro entrevistado é Richard Clarke, que era o responsável pelo combate ao terrorismo na Casa Branca quando aconteceram os atentados. Nosso segundo entrevistado é Chalmers Johnson, ex-integrante da CIA, Agência de Informações dos Estados Unidos. Historiador, Johnson publicou pouco antes de 11 de setembro o livro Blowback, no qual previa represálias às intervenções militares dos Estados Unidos no mundo. Richard Clarke era o responsável pelo combate ao terrorismo na Casa Branca, quando aconteceram os atentados de 11 de setembro. Depois passou a cuidar do terrorismo cibernético e deixou o governo por discordar do presidente George W. Bush. Ele falou ao Milênio em sua consultoria de segurança em Arlington, perto da capital americana.
You have apologized to the 9/11 families, and you said you personally had failed them. But as the head of counterterrorism at the White House, you have warned that this was going to happen, that the attack was coming. So you were for the Bush administration what Cassandra was for the Trojans.
I apologize because I think I did fail. Others failed as well. And I'll leave it for history to figure out where to assign the blame and appropriate amounts of failure. But I thought it was important for the families of the victims to hear an apology. And no one had done it. And time had gone on, and the president hadn't said it. No one in the Congress had said it. And I was out of government at the time, so I was speaking for myself.
Yeah, it was 3 years later.
Yeah, I was speaking for myself. And what is surprising to me is even after I said it, no one else did. They're unwilling to say that they made any mistakes. And even in Bush's new book, which glosses over so much, he never says that he made mistakes or that this could have been avoided. And the fact is that we did warn them that something was coming. We didn't know exactly when or exactly where. But they ignored the entire issue of terrorism and the threat from bin Laden, the threat from Al-Qaeda for 9 months. And I think that's a little hard to explain.
For a year and a half, more than 60 people in the CIA knew that there were two men in the U.S. territory who turned out to be part of the 9/11 terrorists. And there were many other signs. Is this something that could lead one to think, well, maybe there was a decision to let that happen?
Yeah, no decision was made to let it happen. But I think both the 9/11 Commission and the Joint Congressional Inquiry both raised questions about why CIA knew that there were two Al-Qaeda people in the country and didn't tell me, didn't tell the White House, didn't tell the FBI until a few weeks before 9/11. And both investigations really didn't answer the question, why did CIA fail to tell anybody? So I think there is an unanswered and important question 10 years later, which still, I think, needs to be answered. Who in the CIA decided not to tell anyone, and why did they make that decision? And if 60 people in CIA have that information, this is not a mistake. It's not an oversight. It's an intentional decision that would had to have been made at a very high level.
What do you think happened?
I don't know. I think it's at least possible that CIA, in cooperation with the Saudi intelligence service, perhaps hoped that they could convert these two people into double agents, and may have been trying to do that. And I think they feared, potentially, that if they told me, or they told the FBI, that there were these Al-Qaeda guys in the United States, that we would have had them arrested. And then the opportunity to convert them to double agents would have gone away. That's just a theory, and I don't know that is the case. All I know is that 60 people in CIA knew about it, These guys were in the country for over a year. CIA told me everything else, every last detail. The director of CIA would call me on the telephone almost daily, and yet that piece of information didn't get to me or the FBI. So something needs to be explained.
Maybe they were already double agents?
I don't think so.
No. How has 9/11 affected you personally, emotionally?
Well, I think on the day of 9/11, I tried very hard to shut off my emotions and just do the job, because there would have been an enormous amount of anger. Anger at my own government, and anger at my president. And there was no room for that, no place for that on 9/11 or in the days immediately thereafter. We just had to do the job. But the more time went on, the angrier I got. And then when I realized that they were going to try to use this as a justification for invading a country, Iraq, that had nothing to do with 9/11, I got very angry. Because I knew, and I think everybody should have known, that invading Iraq was going to result in thousands of deaths. And it did. It resulted in more Americans getting killed than on 9/11. It resulted in 100,000 or more Iraqis getting killed, most of them innocent people, and millions of innocent Iraqis being made refugees in their own country and having to leave their own country. They really let loose the dogs of war and justified it on the basis of 9/11. They were manipulating the emotions of the American people, and that made me extremely angry. And I quit the government after 30 years in the government and started campaigning against President Bush and his policies.
And the Bush administration tried to destroy your reputation. How has that affected you?
Well, I knew they would. That's the way they operated. They didn't get very far. You know, after all, they were a Republican administration. I was a civil servant. I worked for Republican presidents. I worked for Democratic presidents. But the point was, I had worked for Republican presidents in the White House, in the Pentagon, in the State Department. Bush's father. I had lots of Republican friends in the Congress. So they didn't get very far trying to blame me.
As part of your job at the White House, you became involved in counter cyber terrorism and cyber war. And that became your main interest. Is cyber war a bigger threat than run-of-the-mill terrorism like Al-Qaeda and stuff like that?
Well, it depends on your scope. So there's cyber crime is a new phenomenon since we started working on this. And that's a multi-billion-dollar threat to banks and to average citizens every year. There's also cyber spying, cyber espionage, where people are stealing information from other companies. So they're stealing intellectual property, engineering designs, chemical formulas. And this is a real risk for economic competitiveness. And I think it's a very serious problem. Then there's cyber war, where nation states can go after each other and turn off the electric power or whatever. That hasn't happened very much. And it's not going to happen until countries are going to go to war anyway. If a country is going to go to war now and in the future, it will use cyber attacks as well as regular attacks. But cyber war is only going to happen as often as war happens.
Yeah, but you wrote in your book that cyber war has already begun because preparation for it has begun.
Well, I think that's right. So in order to carry out a cyber attack, to cause trains to stop moving, water to stop being pumped, pipelines to explode, electric power to go off, in order to do that when you want to do it, you already have to have penetrated the networks. You can't start, you can't have the president tell you, I want to do this, and start that day to try to figure out how to do it. So nations are already penetrating each other's networks and putting in back doors into the networks so that they can get in quickly when they want to.
No próximo bloco, o ex-integrante da CIA, Chalmers Johnson, fala dos atentados de 11 de setembro como represália ao imperialismo americano. A segunda entrevista deste Milênio especial é com o historiador e ex-integrante da CIA, a Central de Inteligência dos Estados Unidos, Chalmers Johnson. Ele é o autor de uma trilogia em que criticava os custos para a manutenção da hegemonia norte-americana e previu que algo como o 11 de setembro aconteceria em reação à imposição da presença americana no mundo. Thomas Johnson ficou célebre depois dos atentados de 11 de setembro de 2001, que ele, de certa forma, previu no primeiro livro da trilogia, Blowback, publicado no Brasil com o título em inglês. Blowback, ou retaliação, é um termo usado na CIA, a agência de espionagem americana, para descrever situações em que ações americanas provocam represálias. Johnson, que trabalhou para a CIA e se aposentou como professor de história das universidades de Berkeley e San Diego, recebeu o Milênio em sua casa no sul da Califórnia. First, let's talk about Blowback, the first book in your trilogy. What does it mean, the concept for you?
Reaction to American foreign policy. It is simply that is, a better translation might be retaliation. But it does mean, above all, reaction. That is the response to it. The Americans don't usually anticipate it, almost never anticipate it accurately. They have a tendency to think that they are doing good in the world and that other people agree with them, and that therefore they're surprised by some of the reactions they get. But that's basically what it means. It was I was writing it in the late 1990s, before the turn of the century, and it seemed to me then that the main foreign policy problems for the United States in the coming decades were going to be things left over from the last half of the 20th century, and that they were piling up, that it was not going to be good news.
And then after the book came out, September 11 happened.
That's right. People keep saying, oh my God, he predicted it. Well, I didn't obviously predict it, except in one sense, that I said there will be a backlash, if you will. It would be a different term, from the third world, from the nations that we have intimidated. I'm just, thanks to President Chavez of Venezuela, I'm just in the process of finishing up, I'm almost finished, with Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America. My God, what a fantastically important work it really is. It's the only thing I just think it's astonishing, and how few Americans know anything about it.
I can't say that you predicted, but reading your book, one can see what would be the American reaction to 9/11.
Ah, yes. Well, the Americans still remain a little shocked. Shocked by the thought that they are not universally loved, that their armed forces are really armed forces rather than armed missionaries or something of this sort. And so that I think they overreacted badly.
The reaction of an empire.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was simply saying, of course it's an empire, and even though the Americans refuse to acknowledge it, and it's not an empire in the usual sense used by the Europeans to mean colonies, that it is, in some ways, I would say, an empire much more like that of the former Soviet Union. It's an empire of military bases, of which we have over 800 in countries other than our own around the world. It's unimaginably expensive. It has almost nothing to do with American security. It is a way of maintaining hegemony, that is, control, dominance over the rest of the world. And though we refuse to admit it, we like it.
But one thing that you show is the decline of that empire, the overstretching of that empire.
All empires do. And this one certainly is. And and you wouldn't know it or wouldn't understand it or foresee it because you've never been candid about what it was in the first place. The fact that we're not liked. Americans can't imagine what it's like having several thousand youthful, oversexed, often racially biased, certainly culturally biased, young Americans, heavily armed, living cheek by jowl with them. It's extremely unpleasant. We don't understand that. We don't know anything about it. We have very little empathy for it. And it is Well, it's in fact one of my main criticisms of President Obama. I like what he's done. I voted for him. I was a supporter of his. But I think he's been wildly out of his depth and refusing to pay attention to the effects of our military bases around the world, which also are contributing to our tremendous economic difficulties. We can't afford this expense any longer.
So in your books, you also predict that there's going to be, and there has been, a blowback in the economy. So
yes.
the bankruptcy of America because of its, as a consequence of its overstretched imperial reach.
And it's erroneous belief that we are, that our wealth is unlimited, that we can go and do anything we want to. The almost crazy notion that you can dominate the world in a purely military sense. We are no longer, by any stretch of the imagination, the world's economic hegemon. We've lost that position rather decisively. When Britain was in that position after the First World War, we saw the decline of the British Empire quite markedly. And finally leading up to the end of World War II, when they decided, if we're going to remain a democracy, we've got to get rid of the empire. We can't continue to rule countries like India using essentially Nazi methods, having just defeated the Nazis in World War II. This is in some ways what was in my mind to say, as we came along in the late 1990s, end of Cold War, disappearance of the Soviet Union, things of this sort, why aren't we in this country talking about liquidating this huge apparatus around the world that we've developed vested interest in it, but that we're not rationally deciding what it's for, nor are we even beginning to look at, say, its effects in countries like Latin America, where our record, as Galeano marvelously describes, is simply abominable.
Do you still see a risk that America, to keep its empire, would sacrifice democracy?
It's conceivable. That is, that's one of the main analytical arguments that I'm trying to put forward in all three of these books, is that historically, going back to the Roman Empire, we have ample evidence that a nation can be an empire or it can be a democracy, but it can't be both.
So what would be the most dangerous situation? Pakistan?
Well, probably Pakistan is one, in the sense that it's a weak country, being meddled with by naive people. We just simply refuse to be candid on the subject of you can't really win friends through bayonets, that the military isn't going to do it, that it strikes me as one of the weirdest propositions in international politics is to think that you can cause the Pakistani people to put their trust in the United States, since it's allied with the two most anti-Muslim countries on earth, India and Israel. Under these circumstances, that's implausible, and you should not anticipate it. And so that it is a very dangerous situation, but I think it would be, the thing is, it's not going to erupt. It's going to be unstable. The question is, does the instability affect us in any way? Not too seriously. And India will be extremely alert over this one. China will be too, for a long, long time. And we should quit believing that every situation of this sort on earth requires our normally incompetent attention.
But you believe that America as a democracy can still choose to divest itself of empire?
Yes, I think it still could.
But how?
Well, I can't think of anything other than mobilization from below. That is, an educated public, aware of what they're about to lose, that once they do lose it, they'll never get it back.
That is democracy.
Democracy. That is, The Roman Republic was a genuine democracy. The American Constitution just reeks of Roman precedences, vetoes and other such Latinate words everywhere in it. We also know that the founders of the United States and the authors of the Constitution were enthusiasts for the Roman Republic. Well, once it was gone, it didn't come back for 1,000 years. And we should bear that in mind. It's about the only country that I can think of that voluntarily gave up their empire was Nikita Gorbachev, realizing that it was no longer worth it, that he would rather have friendly relations with France and Germany than with those crummy republics that Stalin had created in East Europe. And he tried it. He ran into huge vested interests that have not worked out perfectly by any manner of means. But the threat from Russia is certainly diminished. Russia is today a much smaller place than it was when it was the Soviet Union. And the trends have been in the right direction. We should be encouraging it rather than standing in their way.
Se você quiser assistir a íntegra dessas duas entrevistas e deixar comentários sobre o programa de hoje, entre no blog do Milênio, no site da Globo News.